702.
The Naked Scientist.
Naked Scientist time. Dr. Chris Smith is with us. Doctor, you already heard the first question
Go on.
about the 10,000 hours.
Yeah, it was someone in South Africa who first put me onto this and said, read this book. In order to be really good at something, you've got to do it for 10,000 hours. And it stopped and made me think. I actually did the calculation. And yeah, I thoroughly agree, because you see this in yourself. And if you look at anything that you do, the more you do it, the better you get. We're built like that. But you get to a point where you know that you're going to be able to do it and do it well. And there's this sort of mental transition. Because I remember when I first started making radio programs, I used to spend about 90% of my time panicking about what was coming out of my mouth and about 10% actually thinking about what I wanted to come out of my mouth. And then after a period of time, this magical thing happens, and you're probably in the same position where you forget you're making a radio program and focus on having a conversation. And that equation reverses, and there's about 10% healthy panic. And about 90% is cognitive energy, and I want to have an interesting chat with somebody. And you get into the zone, as it were. And it's the same with anything you do. You start to revert a lot of this stuff. Instead of being front of mind, having to think about every single thing you're saying and doing and where you're putting your fingers and hands and what buttons you're pressing, it's all happening at a lower level in your brain, automatically, like an autopilot, so that you can really focus on finessing the top layer, the sort of icing on the cake, as it were. And I think that's what he's getting at.
It's almost like muscle memory, like when dancers rehearse a routine over and over again, or instrumentalists rehearse. When they're on stage performing, they're not sitting thinking about the next move. The body automatically knows what to do, so you get to a point where you actually enjoy it.
Yeah, and I also think that you end up getting very good at sort of thinking things through in parallel. So you're able to think multiple moves ahead in the chess game. That's what being good at something is. If you're a surgeon operating, you're already pre-planning the what-ifs, so that if anything did go wrong, your hand is already ready to go with the right deft movement to stop something going wrong. Or if you're a really good driver, a really good racing driver, you've already thought about all the possible eventualities that might happen when you get to that point in the circuit, and you already have a plan in place. And it's that parallel thinking, I think, that comes with experience and practice, but also knowing how to implement your plan A, plan B, plan C, and have them all ready to go in parallel. So it doesn't matter what happens, you always look like you know what you're doing, because even if your plan A fails, you're already onto your plan B, and it's seamless and a smooth transition. Really good performers know this. If you watch someone who's on stage singing or whatever, they're just doing that dynamically, and they're compensating for the timing was out by one of the other musicians and something else went wrong. You don't even notice. And it's only when they point these things out to you and they say, oh, that happened, then that happened. You think, oh, yeah, you're right. But you were so good at your job, I didn't notice. And it's true in any kind of live scenario, I think. And I mean, it was really interesting. I spoke to someone from Rolls-Royce last week, because the week before last, Eric Moody died. You may not know the name, but he was a British Airways pilot who in 1982 was flying to Western Australia from Indonesia when he unwittingly flew through the plume of a volcano, and it stopped all four engines on his aircraft. And he knew they had about 20 minutes of altitude gliding before they were in the sea. And rather than panic like mad, he managed to get that plane safely down on the ground by taking everyone through what the rule book said you should do and calmly getting everything together until they got at least one engine, and finally all the engines, one a bit sputtery, going again, and became famous because of it. But it was the first real documented case of a successful outcome from that kind of thing, and we learned a huge amount because of it. But it was that cool under pressure, calmness, ability to think clearly because you've got good at something. That is what I think the 10,000 hours is all about.
Thank you so much for that clarity. Nelly in Woodlands says, what is the impact of sweeteners in the human body? I'm asking because sweeteners take long to digest. Just like sugar, the impact of it causing obesity was not calculated until recent researchers. And they're not specifying if they are including things like xylitol and what's that other one? There's another one.
There's a whole suite, if you excuse the pun, of molecules which the reason we use them is because they fool your taste receptors in your mouth into thinking something is sugar, because they are capable of acting against the same structure and activating the thing that sugar would activate. But because they're a different molecule, they are not compatible with metabolism. So they taste sweet, but they don't actually impact any or impart any energy punch. And so when this was first discovered that you could do this by tricking your nervous system into thinking it's seeing sugar, but it's seeing something that tastes a bit like sugar, but has none of the calories, everyone thought, well, this is it. This is the secret to how we keep people lean and trim and slim. And you can have all the benefits and the lovely taste of sugar, but you don't have to have the aftermath, which is it going on your hips. And it turns out that all that glitters is not gold, and this does leave a bad taste in your mouth, literally as well as metaphorically, because there are a number of possible outcomes from this. Some of these things break down into other substances that might be harmful, although the evidence is scant. There is evidence that there might be an increase in risk of certain metabolic changes and metabolic disorders from some of these things, and the other thing it might do is reprogram your ability to count calories so that it tempts you to overindulge in future. So let me explain. If in a normal person, when you're eating something, your brain gauges how many calories it's taking in. So people are anticipating what they've eaten and feeling full before their stomach's actually full, as it were. So they know when they've had enough. And this is because your brain is basically counting the calories into the body based on a number of assessments, like how much you're eating, how sweet it is, etc. If you reprogram that system by consistently eating things that taste sweet but impart no calories, your brain down regulates how many calories it anticipates a sweet thing will give you, so that when you do eat something that's genuinely sugary, you tend to overindulge because your brain says, well, there's no calories coming from that. So it might have a knock-on effect and encourage people to overeat when in fact they were seeking to undereat because of eating these sweeteners. So at the moment, people are looking very carefully at this. They're watching the industry. There are some vague associations between how these molecules may affect different aspects of metabolism and health. They may have health impacts in other ways. But what we do know is that probably prevention is better than cure. And eating a healthy diet that is representative of all of the different food groups and doesn't contain an excess of any of them, including sugar, is the best way to go, because once you do put on the weight, it's much harder to shift it and then return to a healthy weight than if you don't put it on in the first place.
All right. There is a question, and thank you for that, Nelly. This one is unsigned. Where is the moon hidden when it gets half and quarter moon? Because we know the sky is very far from it.
Yep. It's not hidden by anything. The moon is in orbit around the Earth, and the Earth turns inside the orbit of the moon, and the moon takes 1 month to do a complete lap of the Earth. So if you just think about that for a moment, you've got the Earth sitting in the middle, the moon is going around the Earth, but it takes a month to do that journey, and the Earth is turning in 24 hours each complete revolution. So this is why the moon rises and sinks, because the Earth is turning inside the orbit of the moon, and that gives the moon an apparent appearance over the horizon, across the sky, and then down again. But because as it's going each day, it's an hour further across the sky when it appears, this is why the moon has these phases to it, because what we're seeing when we see the moon in the sky is the surface of the moon illuminated by the sun and reflecting the sun's light towards us. So if the moon is in the sky with its face fully illuminated by the sun, we see a full moon. But as the moon goes around, and if you think about this, if you sort of get an apple and an orange and pretend one's the Earth, one's the moon, and move them around each other, you'll see that as the Earth rotates and the moon goes around the Earth, eventually you'll get to a point where the moon is behind the Earth and it can't be illuminated, you can't see it, or it's got its backside to the sun and its front face to us and can't be illuminated. So in those circumstances, you're going to see a full or a new moon. And when it is round to the side, only part of the surface that we can see is being illuminated. So we see a different phase. We see a half of the moon. It's not being hidden by anything. It's not being cut off, or that's not a pattern of the Earth's shadow or something. That is because the moon is being illuminated by the sun, but we're only seeing it from an angle. So we only see part of its surface lit up and reflecting light towards us.
Thank you so much for that question. Another one says, please ask Dr. Chris, what happens in the brain when one suffers a stroke? And we know that it's not the same with everybody. Maybe, doctor, you can explain the worst case scenario.
Well, the brain is one of our most metabolically active organs. It's got the highest energy use of almost anything in the body. And this means that it needs a very big blood supply in order to bring in enough energy and enough oxygen to meet the demands of the brain tissue. And this means that if anything happens to that blood supply, very quickly brain function stops working properly and may even be damaged irreversibly. And when we have a stroke, what is happening is that something has affected the ability of blood to reach all the different parts of the brain. The most common kind of stroke is where a thrombus, in other words, a blood clot or some kind of material, has blocked a blood vessel supplying the brain. And most of the time, 85% of the time, those things come from outside your head. So it'll be damage to the arteries in your neck, for example. They'll form a blood clot which will break away, go up into the skull, and then lodge in a blood vessel which is small enough and smaller than the obstruction. This cuts off the flow of blood to anything downstream of that blood vessel, and that territory in the brain and whatever job it does will quite quickly stop working properly. And if you don't unblock and restore that circulation very promptly indeed, irreversible damage happens to that bit of the brain. Now, under other circumstances, you can also get what we call hemorrhagic stroke. And what happens there is that rather than blocking a blood vessel, you burst a blood vessel. And this can happen around the brain, that's called a subarachnoid hemorrhage, or inside the brain itself, that's called an intracerebral hemorrhage. But in both cases, the outcome is the same. Again, there's a lack of blood flow to the right parts of the brain. There's also an increase in pressure inside the skull because the blood takes up space and squeezes on the brain tissue, and that makes it harder for blood to get into the brain and supply all the tissue, especially in the area where the blood clot is, if you've bled inside your brain. And that pressure further compounds the injury from the stroke. And when someone has a stroke, you notice what we call immediately a focal neurological deficit. So the brain is divided up into different regions that do different jobs, and generally the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and there's a map of the body on the brain, so the area of the brain that's affected tends to map onto that body map, so it causes symptoms in the part of the body that is controlled by the affected part of the brain. And so by looking at what's happened to somebody, because usually this deficit will come on very quickly, you can work out where in the brain they're likely to have a problem most of the time, and what sort of problem they're likely to be having based on the way it came on and the sorts of symptoms that they have, and also their past medical history might give you a clue as well. If we see this happening, we act as promptly as we possibly can to try to restore the circulation to the brain. So we give someone a brain scan and we see if we can see why they've got a stroke, whether it's a bleed or whether a blood vessel has become blocked, and then we start to see whether or not we can unclog the blood vessel. There are various ways to do that to get the circulation going again as soon as possible, because time is brain cells, and all the time you're not supplying them with a healthy supply of blood, your brain cells begin to die off and you won't get them back. So time is brain tissue, and that's the most important thing, is to try to get the person's circulation back to normal, or as close to normal as you possibly can, as fast as you can, and then you look after them in terms of rehabilitating them longer term.
Thank you so much for that question from Hola in Kempton Park, who asks, why are vehicle batteries rectangular and not any other shape?
Well, they can be other shapes. It depends actually on how many cells they tend to contain and how big those cells are, because a battery is a cluster of cells. And in a car battery, most of the time what we're using are sulfuric acid batteries, where there are lead plates and the electrolyte, the liquid, is sulfuric acid, and the voltage of those is 2 volts. And so you need 6 of them in a line in order to make a battery which is 12 volts, normal car voltage. And generally those plates are rectangular, so they tend to be wider than they are high. And so they stack them together to make 2-volt cells, 6 in a row, that happen to be an oblong in shape. But some batteries are 6 volts, and I've got an old vintage car that I rebuilt for my wife for her birthday. She had a special birthday, and she'd always wanted an MGB Roadster. So I managed to get one that had been dead in a barn for about 20 years from an auction, and they had 2 6-volt batteries that were connected in series, one on one side of the car, one on the other. And because they're 6 volts, that's 3 cells, and in fact they are square shapes. And you connect them together to make a 12-volt battery, but you've got 2 square-shaped batteries to do it. So it's not 100% given that they're always going to be an oblong. It's just what accommodates those lead plates with those voltages to give you the right capacity for the starting current you need to generate from that battery for that vehicle.
All right. Thank you so much for that question. We go to the lines. Andrew in Randfontein. Andrew, go ahead.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. I just wanted to ask the site, maybe, is it possible that stroke can be reversed?
Hi, Andrew. The answer is that a full-blown stroke can be reversed if very promptly you restore circulation. You can minimise the damage done to the brain tissue. But what some people have is what we call a reversible neurological deficit, or a RIND, or a mini stroke. It also sometimes gets called a TIA, transient ischemic attack. And what happens there is that a person will present with the symptoms of a stroke, but they clinically resolve within a short time, and the person then recovers fully. And we think what's happened under those circumstances is something caused a momentary interruption to a blood supply to a part of the brain, and that caused the symptoms, but usually they're a herald of more trouble in store. So if these happen, and if you get this sort of thing, if you suddenly lose your vision on one side and then it comes back, or you feel numbness or weakness in your fingers or one side of your body, your speech goes slurry, your face drops, for example. If this happens and then it goes away again, and you think, well, that was a bit weird, I'm glad that's gone away, take it seriously and get investigated, because very often in the aftermath of that happening, it is a herald that things are on the move and there could be something worse waiting in the wings unless you can intervene. So if you get any of these sorts of symptoms, with any of these symptoms anyway, never delay. But if you do get that, do get it investigated.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for your question. And to those of you who didn't get through, we are back next Monday.